Boeing says it's addressing the safety recommendations issued by the Indonesian authorities about the 737 MAX. The report, which was released, the final report, by the way, of the Indonesian ethics, lays out 9 different factors that contributed to the Lion Air crash. And it's worth today just showing how complex this is. The responsibility is really shared between Boeing, the manufacturer, the regulator, the FAA, the airline, and the way it trained its crew and did its maintenance, and the pilots. So watch. The first mistake, of course, they recognised, or the first problem, was the assumption of pilot responsibilities. How would pilots respond to MCAS, this software, when it activated? They got that wrong. But that was Boeing and the FAA that got that wrong. They failed to understand. Then you have the regulators certifying a design with only one sensor that would activate. Again, joint there. Boeing's decision to install only one sensor in the first place, arguably, that is Boeing's fault and responsibility. The lack of guidance on the system for pilots, that probably goes to the airline, Boeing, and probably the regulator, all of them. We'll put it down here for the moment, although the airlines didn't really know, so it probably belongs there. Boeing could have enabled an AOA disagree alert, but they didn't. You're starting to see how this thing comes together. There was a replacement sensor, miscalibrated. That's the airline's responsibility. And, by the way, the FAA, that's just revoked the licence of the repair shop. It's unclear if it was tested properly. That, again, is the airline's responsibility. Flight and maintenance logs. A previous flight had similar problems and it wasn't reported. That goes to airline and pilots. And then you have workload management. Were they trained properly? You get the idea. You start to see how it's simply too simplistic to say it was one or the other, but the bulk of responsibility goes to Boeing and the regulator. David Soucie is with me to talk about it. David, I've gone through that in some detail. Tell me why I'm wrong or right.
Well, I think you're right in looking at it the way you are. The challenge is going to be how they move forward now. The commonality with everything that you've mentioned is the fact that the communication, the way that things are communicated between every entity within this complex system is what is weak. And that's something that we've had challenges on. Back in 2004, we had a rulemaking committee to try to fix this problem, but it didn't happen. It didn't end up or result in some kind of regulatory authority, because you can see how complex this is, how things work together. And when they work together improperly, any step along the way can cause that problem.
Right, but what we saw here, of course, is that if you think of it, I mean, I'm not being flippant when I say this, if you think about it as a cake being baked, you know, the ingredients were all put in by Boeing and the FAA, but how it was cooked was the airline and the pilots. And these pilots, you know, good men to be sure, but the first officer simply did not have the airmanship to handle this situation. They didn't even know the system existed.
The question is, should he have had that level of competency to be able to do this? You look at Sully. Did he do it right? Did he? A lot of people question whether he could have gotten back to the airport, but he didn't. So there's those kinds of things that all has to be considered. In the teleconference with Boeing this morning, the senior VP was talking exactly about this, about the fact that it takes 1 second to recognize an issue, and then it takes up to 3 seconds to respond to that issue. And that's the regulatory requirement. And that's the challenge here, is who didn't see that it was going to take longer for them to do that? How could they recognize and react if they didn't know the system existed in the first place? So again, in accident investigation, I've got to go back to the root causes, and if not, we'll get too complicated and too finger pointing at everything and never find any way to make it better in the future.
The corrections or modifications, excuse me, being put forward by Boeing, you know, first of all, they have to be 2 sensors that have to agree. It can only fire once, MCAS. It can never be more strain than the pilot can countermand. But arguably, this is something that Boeing has had in its ethos. Pilots in control, redundancy of systems, safety first. How did they manage to lose the way?
That's the question, Richard, and that's the question that I just got done asking the vice president over at Boeing, and I'm going up there within the next week or two to get that answer. They didn't answer that directly to me. But they did tell me that they've done a lot of things to improve that communication and to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And I'm pretty confident in what they're doing. They're making some changes in their information sharing where the lessons learned that they get aren't shared just within a specific model of aircraft, but across the entire organization, which was not done before. So let's say, for example, something similar to this happened on a different model or a different type of device. Now you've got this communication that's going to share it across. So those lessons learned and those assumptions will be carried on.